Blood on the marble floor wasn't part of Penelope's Tuesday itinerary. Neither was the city's most feared crime lord wrapping his custom Italian suit jacket over her trembling, plus-sized frame. "My ex called me fat," she whispered. Anthony Callahan smiled a terrifying, soulless curve. "Then we'll feed him his own tongue." Champagne flutes clinked like wind chimes inside the grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria. Penelope Hayes adjusted the collar of her black catering uniform, feeling the familiar, suffocating pinch of the fabric against her thick waist. As a size 22 woman, in a room full of socialites who survived on celery dust and arrogance, Penelope always felt like a boulder dropped into a pond of swans. She was the owner and head chef of Sweet Providence, a rising gourmet bakery in New York, and tonight was supposed to be her crowning achievement. She had secured the catering contract for the prestigious Harrison and Gable Charity Gala. Instead, it was turning into a nightmare. Across the room, standing by the ice sculpture, was Brandon Pierce. Brandon was her ex-fiancé, a junior partner at a massive wealth management firm, and the architect of her deepest insecurities. For 3 years he had treated Penelope not as a partner, but as a renovation project. He had locked cabinets, thrown away her baking experiments, and subjected her to daily weigh-ins. When she finally found the courage to pack her bags and leave him a year ago, she thought she had escaped his shadow. She was wrong. Penelope busied herself with arranging miniature tartlets on a silver platter, her plump fingers trembling slightly, as Brandon detached himself from the crowd and swaggered toward her station. He had a stunning, razor-thin brunette clinging to his arm. Well, if it isn't Penelope," Brandon sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. He leaned against her catering table, his eyes raking over her full figure with blatant disgust. "I see the catering business is treating you a little too well. Or are you just eating all the profits?" Penelope's face flushed a deep, humiliating crimson. She kept her eyes glued to the tartlets. "Brandon, please, I'm working." "Working?" He laughed loudly, drawing the attention of several nearby guests. "Is that what you call it? You're serving snacks to people who actually matter. Tell me, Penny, have you hit 300 pounds yet? Because from the look of those thighs spilling out of that skirt, you're breaking new records." "My ex called me fat. I used to tell my friends, but honestly, fat is an understatement." "You're pathetic." The brunette on his arm giggled, burying her face in Brandon's shoulder. Penelope felt the hot sting of tears pricking her eyes. The trauma of his emotional abuse rushed back, crushing the confidence she had spent 12 months rebuilding. She felt massive, grotesque, and entirely invisible all at once. "Leave her alone." The voice was quiet. It didn't boom over the chatter of the ballroom, yet it possessed a dark, magnetic gravity that made the surrounding air freeze. Anthony Callahan stepped into the soft glow of the chandelier. He was a towering figure of broad shoulders and bespoke charcoal wool, with eyes the color of a stormy Atlantic Ocean. Officially, Anthony was the CEO of Callahan Enterprises, a sprawling logistics company. Unofficially, he was the undisputed boss of the Irish-Italian syndicate running the eastern seaboard. He was a man who spoke softly and let his body count do the shouting. Brandon turned his arrogant smirk, faltering, as he recognized the man. Every finance bro in New York knew Anthony Callahan, and they knew better than to cross him. "Mr. Callahan, I was just catching up with an old acquaintance." "You were obstructing the dessert station," Anthony said, his voice smooth, devoid of any recognizable warmth. "And polluting the air with your breath. Walk away, Mr. Pierce." Brandon swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He nodded stiffly, grabbed his date's arm and scurried back toward the bar, throwing one last venomous glance at Penelope. Penelope couldn't hold it in anymore. The overwhelming humiliation and the sudden release of tension broke her. She abandoned her station, pushing through the heavy velvet curtains and stepping out onto the deserted stone balcony overlooking the glittering city skyline. The crisp night air hit her flushed cheeks as she leaned heavily against the balustrade, letting the tears fall. She heard the soft scuff of expensive leather shoes behind her. Anthony stepped out into the chill, holding 2 glasses of whiskey. He offered one to her. "I don't drink while I work," she murmured, wiping her cheeks, frantically ashamed that this beautiful, terrifying man was witnessing her breakdown. "You aren't working right now," Anthony replied, gently stepping closer. "You're breathing. Take the glass, Penelope." She took it, her soft fingers brushing against his calloused knuckles. A jolt of electricity shot up her arm. She had only ever spoken to Anthony in brief professional exchanges when he frequented her bakery to buy her signature dark chocolate eclairs. She never imagined he knew her name, let alone paid attention to her. "I'm sorry," she whispered, looking down at her stomach, wishing she could carve away the parts of herself that Brandon had taught her to hate. "You shouldn't have seen that." Anthony leaned against the railing next to her, his gaze intense and unwavering. "What I saw was an insect buzzing around a queen. What did he say to you?" Penelope squeezed her eyes shut. The words burned in her throat. She felt so stupid, so vulnerable. My ex, called me fat," she whispered into the darkness, the confession cracking her voice in two. "He's right, I am. I try to hide it, I try to dress for it, but I just take up too much space." Anthony didn't laugh. He didn't offer a hollow, socially acceptable platitude. Instead, he reached out his large, warm hand, gently gripping her chin, forcing her to look at him. His eyes were ablaze with a terrifying protective fire. "You take up exactly the amount of space you are meant to, Penelope," Anthony said, his thumb tracing the soft curve of her jawline. "Your body is a sanctuary. It is soft and it is beautiful, and it drives me absolutely out of my mind every time you hand me a pastry over that counter." Penelope gasped, her breath hitching in her chest. As for Brandon Pierce, Anthony continued his tone, shifting from velvet warmth to cold-hardened steel. "He will learn the penalty for speaking against what is mine. You will never shed another tear over him. Do you understand me?" Monday morning arrived with a torrential downpour washing the streets of Manhattan in a bleak grey sheen. For Brandon Pierce, the storm was just beginning. He walked into the glass-walled offices of Harrison and Gable at exactly 8 a.m., holding his double-shot espresso, ready to pitch a multi-million-dollar merger. Instead, his keycard flashed red at the turnstile. 2 burly security guards escorted him to human resources. There he was handed a termination letter, citing gross misconduct and financial discrepancies. When Brandon demanded an explanation, the HR director simply slid a folder across the desk containing photographs of Brandon engaging in illegal insider trading photos that had mysteriously arrived on the CEO's desk 30 minutes prior. By noon, Brandon's luxury apartment lease was suddenly and inexplicably revoked due to a clerical error that the landlord refused to fix. By 3 o'clock, his customized Porsche was repossessed by a towing company that had no record of a repo order, but took the car anyway. Brandon was standing on the wet sidewalk, holding a cardboard box of his office supplies, dialing his powerful friends. Nobody answered. He had been socially and financially erased in a matter of hours. Meanwhile, miles away, in a sprawling, highly fortified estate in the Hamptons, Penelope was completely unaware of the apocalypse raining down on her ex. She had received a call Sunday evening from Anthony's chief of staff, offering her triple her usual rate to privately cater a week-long series of executive meetings at the Callahan estate. The money was too good to pass up enough to finally open the second bakery location she had been dreaming of. When she arrived, however, there were no executives. There were no meetings. There was only Anthony. He was sitting at the head of a massive mahogany dining table, wearing a dark Henley shirt that hugged his muscular torso, reading a leather-bound ledger. The fire crackling in the hearth cast dancing shadows across his sharp jawline. "Mr. Callahan?" Penelope asked tentatively, wheeling her cart of fresh ingredients into the grand dining room. "Where are the guests?" Anthony closed the ledger and stood up, moving toward her, with the slow, deliberate grace of an apex predator. "There are no guests, Penelope. It's just us. I don't understand. I prepped meals for 12 people. I have 30 pounds of braised short ribs and enough risotto to feed an army." She nervously wiped her hands on her apron, hyper-aware of how her generous hips bumped against the edge of the cart. "Then my men outside will eat exceptionally well tonight," Anthony said, stopping mere inches from her. The scent of bergamot and expensive tobacco enveloped her. "I brought you here because I wanted to see you. I wanted you in my home, away from the noise of the city, away from pests." Penelope's heart hammered against her ribs. No man had ever looked at her the way Anthony was looking at her right now. It wasn't the fetishizing gaze of a man chasing a novelty, nor was it the critical dissecting stare of Brandon. It was pure, unadulterated reverence. "Anthony," she breathed, using his first name for the first time. "I'm just a baker. I'm a fat girl from Queens. You run the city. This doesn't make sense." Anthony reached out gently, untying the strings of her apron and pulling it over her head, tossing it aside. He stepped fully into her personal space, his hands coming to rest on her wide hips. Penelope tensed, expecting him to pinch the fat to judge her. Instead, his hands smoothed over her curves with a firm, worshipful pressure. "Stop insulting my future wife," Anthony murmured, leaning down to press a soft, lingering kiss to the side of her neck. Penelope's knees nearly buckled. "Wife, I decided it 6 months ago, when you argued with a delivery driver in the pouring rain over bruised strawberries. You were so fierce. So incredibly beautiful." He whispered, his lips trailing up to her jaw. "Your curves, your softness, they are the only peace I have in a world built on blood and concrete. You are exactly what I crave, Penny. Every single inch of you." He kissed her, then a deep, bruising, possessive kiss that tasted of whiskey and dark promises. Penelope melted against him, her plush body pressing into his hard, unyielding frame. For the first time in her life, she didn't suck in her stomach. She didn't try to shrink herself. Anthony held her as if she were the most precious treasure he had ever plundered, his hands tangling in her hair, pulling her flush against him so she could feel how deeply he wanted her. The afternoon blurred into a haze of sensual discovery. Anthony took her to his massive kitchen, not to have her cook for him, but to cook with her. He made her sit on the marble island, feeding her strawberries, dipped in the dark chocolate she had brought, praising her appetite, praising the soft little sounds she made, praising the lushness of her thighs as she sat cross-legged on the counter. He systematically tore down every insecurity Brandon had ever built, replacing the cold walls of her self-doubt with the blazing fire of his devotion. But outside the fortress of the Callahan estate, a desperate rat was cornered. Brandon Pierce sat in a dingy motel room in New Jersey, his perfectly tailored suit wrinkled and stained with cheap whiskey. He was staring at a corkboard he had hastily assembled. He wasn't entirely stupid. He was an analyst by trade. When his life fell apart, exactly 36 hours after Anthony Callahan threatened him at the gala, he connected the dots. Callahan had destroyed him. and Callahan had done it because of Penelope. A sickening mixture of rage and twisted entitlement boiled over in Brandon's chest. That fat, pathetic baker had ruined his life by crying to a mob boss. He pulled a heavy, unlicensed Glock 19 from his duffel bag, a desperate purchase from a shady contact earlier that afternoon. "You think you can just discard me, Penny?" Brandon muttered to the empty room, racking the slide of the pistol. "You think you're untouchable now?" He didn't know the layout of the Callahan estate, but he knew exactly where Penelope would be on Thursday morning, the grand opening of her new Sweet Providence flagship store in Brooklyn, the one she had poured her entire life savings into. Brandon shoved the gun into his waistband, a manic glint in his bloodshot eyes. If Anthony Callahan wanted to burn Brandon's world to the ground over a fat girl, then Brandon was going to make sure Penelope burned first. Thursday morning dawned bright and crisp over Williamsburg, Brooklyn. The sidewalk outside the new Sweet Providence flagship store on Bedford Avenue was already packed, with a line wrapping around the block. Inside, the air was thick with the intoxicating scent of brown butter, melted Valrhona dark chocolate, and pure Nielsen Massey vanilla extract. Penelope stood behind the gleaming mahogany display cases, her heart swelling with an emotion she hadn't let herself feel in years, pure, unadulterated pride. She was wearing a custom-fitted emerald green wrap dress that cinched perfectly at her waist and draped elegantly over her wide hips and thick thighs. For the first time in her life, she hadn't worn a compression garment underneath. Anthony had kissed every inch of her soft stomach the night before, whispering fiercely that if she ever hid her body from the world again, he would personally burn the clothing industry to the ground. She felt beautiful. She felt powerful. She felt large, and she loved it. "Boss, we need more of the salted caramel brioche up front," called out Sarah, her newly hired pastry assistant, wiping her brow. "Coming right up," Penelope said, smiling radiantly. Outside, a sleek black SUV sat idling across the street. Inside the tinted windows, Anthony Callahan watched the bakery with the intensity of a hawk circling a nest. He had 4 of his best men posted discreetly around the perimeter. Gideon, his massive head of security, was dressed as a local barista, nursing a coffee at the corner, while 3 others blended into the morning commute. Anthony wanted Penelope to have her day in the sun, to revel in her independent success, without the looming shadow of his syndicate, but there was absolutely no chance he was leaving his future wife unprotected. However, desperation breeds a terrifying kind of luck. At the rear of the bakery, the busy loading dock was a chaotic blur of delivery trucks dropping off morning supplies. Baldor Specialty Foods had just dropped 2 pallets of heavy cream and eggs. In the 5-second window it took the delivery driver to get his clipboard signed by the prep cook, a shadow slipped through the propped-open steel door. Brandon Pierce was shivering, though it wasn't cold. He hadn't slept in 3 days. His designer suit was torn at the elbow, his hair greasy and matted. He smelled of stale alcohol and sheer panic. Slipping past the busy prep stations, he moved like a rat through the labyrinth of stainless steel corridors until he reached the private stockroom, a quiet, soundproofed area where Penelope kept her highest-end ingredients. Penelope pushed open the swinging door carrying an empty tray. She walked toward the heavy bags of imported flour, humming a soft tune. "Hello, Penny." Penelope froze. The tray clattered from her hands, hitting the tiled floor with a deafening crash. She spun around to see Brandon, stepping out from behind a rack of wire shelving. He looked deranged, his eyes wide and bloodshot, but it was the dull, heavy metal of the Glock 19, trembling in his right hand, that made the blood drain from Penelope's face. "Brandon," she whispered, taking a slow step backward until her plush hips hit the cold steel of the walk-in freezer door. "Don't move," he hissed, raising the barrel, his finger twitching on the trigger. You ruined me, Penny. You took everything. My job, my apartment, my life. I have absolutely nothing left." Penelope forced herself to take a deep breath. A year ago, this man's mere presence would have sent her into a spiral of self-loathing and panic. But the woman standing in the stockroom was not the same woman who used to weigh herself twice a day to earn a fraction of his affection. She had been touched, worshipped, and claimed by a man who moved mountains just to hear her laugh. "I didn't take anything from you, Brandon," Penelope said, her voice remarkably steady. "Your own arrogance did." Brandon laughed, a hysterical, jagged sound. "Oh, listen to you. So confident now. You think because you cried to a mobster, you're suddenly royalty. You think Anthony Callahan actually cares about you." He stepped closer, jabbing the air with the gun. "Look at you, Penelope. Look at your size. You are a fat, pathetic baker. Men like Callahan don't love women like you. He's using you as a joke, a temporary fetish, until he finds a real woman. You're nothing but a bloated. I would choose your next words very, very carefully." The voice didn't come from Penelope. It came from the shadows of the loading dock hallway. Brandon whipped around wildly, pointing the gun toward the doorway. Anthony Callahan stepped into the fluorescent light of the stockroom. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit. His tie loosened his hands, resting casually in his pockets. He didn't have a weapon drawn. He didn't need one. The sheer suffocating menace radiating from his towering frame was enough to drop the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. Behind him, blocking the only exit, stood Gideon, holding a suppressed tactical pistol aimed squarely at the base of Brandon's skull. "Anthony!" Penelope breathed relief washing over her. Anthony's stormy eyes flicked to her, instantly softening. "Are you hurt, my love?" he asked softly. "No," she replied, standing taller. Anthony's gaze snapped back to Brandon, and the softness vanished, replaced by an abyss of unspeakable violence. "Mr. Pierce, I am incredibly disappointed. I stripped your assets to teach you a lesson in humility. I see the curriculum needs to be adjusted." "Stay back!" Brandon screamed, pointing the gun alternatingly between Anthony and Penelope. "I'll shoot. I swear to God, I'll kill her, Callahan. Call off your man." Anthony didn't flinch. He didn't even break his slow, predatory stride as he walked directly toward the barrel of Brandon's gun. "You are holding a firearm you purchased from a low-level dealer in Newark named Ricky." Anthony said, his voice a low, rhythmic purr. "Ricky buys his stock from a distributor in Red Hook. That distributor works for my underboss. Do you honestly think, Brandon, that a weapon sold on my streets is going to fire at me?" Brandon's eyes widened in horror. He looked at the gun, then back at Anthony. Frantically, he pulled the trigger. Click. Nothing. The firing pin struck an empty chamber. Ricky had sold him a gun with a shaved firing pin and dummy rounds. Before Brandon could even process the realization, Anthony moved with terrifying, blinding speed. His large hand shot out, clamping around Brandon's throat with the force of a steel vice. Anthony lifted the former finance executive 3 inches off the floor, pinning him against the concrete wall. Brandon dropped the useless gun, his hands desperately clawing at Anthony's unyielding grip, his face turning a mottled purple. "You dared to bring a weapon into my wife's sanctuary," Anthony whispered, leaning in so close that Brandon could see his own terrified reflection in the mob boss's cold eyes. "You dared to threaten the woman who holds my beating heart in her hands." Brandon choked his legs, kicking weakly against the air. "Let him drop, boss." Gideon grunted from the doorway. "I'll take him to the Jersey incinerator. No mess." "No," Penelope said. The word rang out clear and authoritative in the small room. Anthony paused his grip, loosening just enough to let Brandon suck in a pathetic, wheezing gasp of air. Anthony turned his head to look at Penelope, waiting for her command. The undisputed king of the eastern seaboard was entirely at the mercy of the soft, beautiful Baker. Penelope walked forward, her emerald dress swishing around her calves. She stopped beside Anthony, looking down at the broken, hyperventilating man who had tortured her for 3 years. She looked at his pathetic sunken eyes and realized she felt absolutely no fear. She only felt pity. "Don't kill him, Anthony," Penelope said smoothly. "He wants to be a martyr. He wants to believe he was ruined by unfair circumstances. Death is too quick for a man who cares so much about status." Anthony's lips curved into a dark, proud smile. "What would my queen suggest?" Penelope looked at Brandon. "You always hated my business, Brandon. You hated my food, you hated my body, and you hated manual labor." She turned to Anthony. "Don't you own those commercial shipping docks in Staten Island, the ones that process the raw fish imports?" Anthony chuckled a deep rumbling sound that made Brandon tremble. "I do." "Make him gut fish," Penelope said, her voice devoid of any sympathy. "Minimum wage, 12-hour shifts. And if he ever quits, or if he ever sets foot in Brooklyn again, you can let Gideon take him to the incinerator." Brandon let out a muffled sob of humiliation, the junior partner of Harrison and Gable reduced to a fish gutter for the rest of his miserable life. Anthony released his grip, letting Brandon crumple to the floor in a weeping, pathetic heap. "Gideon," Anthony commanded, pulling a pristine white handkerchief from his pocket to wipe his hands. "Take Mr. Pierce to the docks. Inform the foreman that our new employee is never to see the sun on a weekend. If he slacks off, break his fingers." "With pleasure, mister," Callahan Gideon said, hauling the sobbing Brandon up by the scruff of his ruined suit and dragging him out through the loading dock. Silence descended upon the stockroom, save for the distant muffled sounds of the bustling bakery out front. Anthony turned to Penelope. The terrifying mob boss vanished, replaced instantly by a man utterly undone by love. He stepped toward her, his hands coming up to cup her face. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, and finally her lips. "You are magnificent," Anthony breathed against her mouth, his hand sliding down to grip her generous waist, pulling her soft body flush against his hard frame. "Absolutely, terrifyingly magnificent. You handled him better than my best lieutenants." Penelope wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in the lapel of his expensive suit, inhaling the comforting scent of him. "I wouldn't have been able to do it without you. You made me feel safe. You make me feel worthy." Anthony pulled back slightly, his eyes fierce. "You were always worthy, Penny. Long before I came along. I just had the privilege of clearing the garbage out of your way, so the rest of the world could see you shine." He smoothed his large hands over the curve of her hips, squeezing gently. "Now I believe there is a line of 100 people out there waiting for the best pastries in New York. And I, for one, would like to sample a very specific salted caramel brioche." Penelope laughed, a rich, joyous sound that echoed off the stainless steel walls. She grabbed his hand, her thick, soft fingers intertwining perfectly with his calloused ones. "I think I can manage to save one for the boss." 6 months later, Sweet Providence had opened 3 more locations across the city. The society pages were plastered with photos of New York's most feared billionaire, tying the knot with the city's culinary sweetheart in a lavish private ceremony in the Hamptons. Penelope wore a custom-designed off-the-shoulder gown that hugged every single luscious curve, looking like a literal goddess of abundance. And somewhere in Staten Island, in a freezing, foul-smelling warehouse, Brandon Pierce scrubbed fish guts off a stainless steel table utterly forgotten by the world, while the woman he called Fat ruled an empire. Did Penelope and Anthony's explosive love story leave you breathless? There is nothing more powerful than a woman stepping into her worth, and the dark, devoted Mafia king who burns the world down just to see her smile. If you loved this fierce, body-positive romance of revenge, passion, and sweet justice, smash that like button, share this dramatic tale with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, heart-pounding stories every single week.